These are 4 of SpongeBob's darkest episodes. Episode 1, I Had an Accident. The episode I Had an Accident starts with SpongeBob enjoying a typical day of sandboarding with Patrick and Sandy. What begins as harmless fun quickly transforms into a psychological study of how a single traumatic event can completely destroy someone's ability to function in normal society. During what should be a simple recreational activity, SpongeBob suffers a severe accident that leaves him hospitalized. While the physical injuries heal, the psychological damage runs much deeper. SpongeBob develops what can only be described as severe agoraphobia, an intense, irrational fear of leaving his house that completely controls his life. This is where SpongeBob's mental state starts to deteriorate completely. He becomes so paralyzed by fear that he refuses to leave his house for any reason. His friends try to help him, but SpongeBob's anxiety has become so severe that he can't even consider stepping outside. He's essentially become a prisoner in his own home, trapped by his own psychological trauma. It was at this moment that we saw how trauma can completely reshape someone's personality. The once adventurous and optimistic SpongeBob becomes a shell of his former self, consumed by anxiety and unable to engage with the world. His fear becomes so intense that he'd rather live in complete isolation than face the possibility of another accident. Compared to what's to come, this episode establishes how a single traumatic event can trigger severe mental health disorders. We watch as SpongeBob develops genuine agoraphobia and PTSD symptoms that completely control his behavior. The episode deals with mature themes of trauma response, anxiety disorders, and social isolation. What makes this particularly disturbing is how it shows how quickly someone's entire worldview can be shattered by a single negative experience, leaving them unable to function in society. Episode 2, Squid's Day Off. The next episode is Squid's Day Off, and this is where we see how obsessive-compulsive behavior can escalate into complete psychological breakdown. This episode starts with Squidward finally getting a day off from the Krusty Krab, leaving SpongeBob alone to run the restaurant. What should be a relaxing break quickly becomes a descent into obsessive paranoia as Squidward becomes convinced that SpongeBob will destroy everything in his absence. This is where Squidward's psychological state becomes genuinely disturbing. Unable to enjoy his freedom, he becomes obsessed with checking on SpongeBob, repeatedly sneaking back to the restaurant to spy on him. His behavior escalates from simple concern to full-blown stalking as his anxiety consumes him completely. But this would all change when Squidward's obsessive behavior begins to control every aspect of his day off. He can't eat, can't relax, and can't think about anything except what might be going wrong at work. His paranoia intensifies to the point where he's convinced that disaster is imminent, even when there's no evidence to support his fears. The most disturbing part comes when Squidward's obsessive checking behavior becomes compulsive and uncontrollable. He's trapped in a cycle of anxiety and checking that he can't break, even though he knows his behavior is irrational. This represents a realistic portrayal of obsessive-compulsive disorder, where the person is aware their behavior is excessive but feels powerless to stop it. This episode doesn't just deal with workplace anxiety. It explores themes of obsessive-compulsive behavior, paranoia, and how anxiety can completely hijack someone's ability to enjoy life. We watch Squidward experience what amounts to a panic disorder episode that ruins what should have been a pleasant day off. The obsessive checking and inability to relax, despite knowing his fears are irrational, mirrors real OCD symptoms in disturbing detail. Episode 3, The Splinter. The third episode is The Splinter, and this ventures into body horror territory that's genuinely nauseating to watch. This episode starts when SpongeBob gets a small splinter in his thumb while working at the Krusty Krab. What begins as a minor injury quickly escalates into a grotesque medical nightmare that showcases some of the most disturbing body horror in the entire series. This is where things get genuinely revolting. Instead of seeking proper medical attention, SpongeBob tries to hide the splinter from Mr. Krabs, fearing he'll be sent home. His attempts to conceal the injury only make it worse, and we watch as the splinter becomes infected and begins to fester in increasingly graphic detail. But this would all change when Patrick tries to help by attempting amateur surgery with a pair of tweezers. His incompetent medical intervention turns a minor injury into a horrific wound. The splinter area becomes swollen, discolored, and begins oozing in ways that are genuinely disturbing to witness. The most nauseating part comes when we see the full extent of the infected wound. The animation doesn't shy away from showing the graphic details of the festering injury, complete with pus, swelling, and tissue damage that would make even adults uncomfortable. The body horror is so intense that it crosses the line from cartoon comedy into genuine medical nightmare. This episode doesn't just deal with minor injuries. It explores themes of medical neglect, body horror, and how avoiding proper healthcare can lead to serious complications. The graphic depiction of infection and tissue damage creates a viewing experience that's genuinely disturbing. What makes this particularly twisted is how the episode uses realistic medical horror in a children's show, potentially traumatizing young viewers with graphic imagery of bodily decay. Episode 4, A Day Without Tears. Although The Splinter takes the cake for body horror, it's still not the darkest. The darkest episode is A Day Without Tears, and this one explores emotional suppression and psychological manipulation in ways that are genuinely harmful. This episode starts when Squidward becomes annoyed by SpongeBob's frequent crying and challenges him to go an entire day without shedding a single tear. What begins as a simple bet quickly escalates into a psychological experiment in emotional suppression that demonstrates dangerous attitudes toward mental health. This is where SpongeBob's psychological torture begins. Throughout the day, he encounters multiple situations that would naturally evoke emotional responses: sadness, frustration, physical pain. But he's forced to suppress all of these natural reactions. His friends actively work to make him cry, turning his emotional suppression into a form of psychological warfare. The most messed up thing in this episode happens when SpongeBob's emotional suppression begins to cause physical and psychological damage. His body starts to swell as he holds back tears, and his mental state becomes increasingly unstable as he's denied the natural emotional release that crying provides. The episode essentially depicts emotional abuse disguised as a game. What makes this particularly twisted is the message it sends about emotional expression. The episode suggests that crying is weakness and that emotional suppression is admirable, which is psychologically harmful. SpongeBob is essentially being conditioned to ignore his natural emotional responses, which can lead to serious mental health problems including depression, anxiety, and emotional dysregulation. Squidward, who initiates this challenge, is essentially conducting psychological abuse by forcing SpongeBob to suppress natural emotional responses. The other characters participate in what amounts to emotional torture, actively trying to trigger SpongeBob's tears while he's struggling to maintain emotional control. This represents a form of psychological manipulation that would be considered abusive in real-world contexts. This episode had multiple dark traits, but the most prominent being emotional abuse and the promotion of unhealthy coping mechanisms. The fact that SpongeBob is forced to suppress natural emotional responses while others actively try to trigger his distress represents psychological torture disguised as entertainment. What's worse is that the episode promotes the dangerous idea that emotional expression is weakness, potentially teaching children to suppress their feelings rather than process them healthily. The physical consequences of emotional suppression shown in the episode, swelling, instability, and distress, mirror real psychological research about the dangers of emotional avoidance. These episodes prove that children's animation can venture into genuinely harmful psychological territory. If you want to see more dark episode analyses, check out this video right here.